playing, and even the palms seem to be swaying when they begin the beat. To live it again is past full endeavor, except when that tune clutches my heart, and there we are swearing to love forever, and promising never, never to part. What moments divine, what rapture serene, till clouds came along to disperse the joys we had tasted. And now when I hear people curse the chance that was wasted, I know but too well what they mean. So don't let them begin the beginning. Let the love that was once afar remain an ember. Let it sleep like the dead desire I only remember. When they begin the beginning, oh yes, let them begin the beginning, make them play, till the stars that were there before return above you, till you whisper to me once more, darling, I love you, and we suddenly know what heaven we're in when they begin the beginning. When they begin, when they begin, oh, when they begin the
Thank you. That was beautiful. And I think there are so many people here this afternoon who will indeed love Professor Katherine Duncan-Jones forever. Friends, welcome to this beautiful non-denominational chapel and to Somerville College, of which Professor Katherine Duncan-Jones was an integral part. She joined the college in 1963 as a Mary Ewart Research Fellow, and the association lasted for 6 decades, only briefly interrupted by a fellowship at New Hall, Cambridge, from 1965 to 1966. Most importantly, she was for 35 years a fellow and tutor in English literature, an inspiring tutor, beloved of her students. Today will be a celebration of the life of a remarkable woman, known affectionately to generations as KDJ, but to whom I will refer as Katherine. A very warm welcome to the family, especially Emily, B, and their children. It's wonderful that so many have joined us today to remember her, but many more of her friends and students are unable to get to Oxford for various reasons, and they have sent messages. One said that they were sorry to miss what they hope will be, and I quote, a suitably festive and joyful tribute to a great scholar, teacher, and human being. In the many tributes, it is the humanity of this globally renowned scholar, a Fellow of the Royal Society of Literature, that shines through, the warmth of her kindness and her generosity. Students remember being shocked and wowed by being offered a glass of champagne in Katherine's room when they were very nervous freshers just arrived in Oxford, and everybody, students and colleagues, remember being in awe of her brilliance and her knowledge. I've heard her described as ethereal, of another world, People were stunned by her youth when she was first appointed. As one student put it, "We weren't sure if she was a graduate student or a bona fide don," and that youthfulness remained. Professor Fiona Stafford, her colleague and friend, tells me that one of her abiding memories of spending time with Katherine was her tremendous sense of fun and her zest for life, as well as her deep interest in all her friends, students and colleagues. I've relied upon Fiona to give me insights about Katherine and Somerville. I met her several times when I arrived in 2017 as her 7th principal, but sadly I didn't really know her. I do know, however, that she was very proud of the college traditions of progressive attitudes and supporting talented women. She was a founder of the college nursery, which is still thriving, and utterly committed to enabling women to continue their scholarship and teaching when they had a family. She was immensely supportive of young women's academic careers, from the first tutorial through to the professional challenges of the academic world. She more than held her own in what was a male-dominated Oxford and always did her best to help younger women do the same. She was incredibly stylish and proud of Somerville for rejecting the Oxford traditions of wearing gowns for dinner, because you couldn't see all our nice dresses under long black gowns. Katherine, on her fabulous bicycle, made a striking impact on all who saw her for many years. She was also one of the most notable presences in the upper reading room of the Bodleian, always in the same part of the reading room, usually in the same seat, always pleased to see her friends in nearby desks, while at the same time utterly focused on her books. As a scholar, Katherine was, as she herself put it, a fearless teller of difficult truths, but the messages suggest that with her students, she was a gentle, dedicated tutor who transmitted a passion for her subject that they have retained over the years. She was truly inspirational. Our college, our society and our world saw many profound changes during her long years of service, not least when Somerville became a mixed college in 1994. But Katherine was a constant for individuals and for our institution. Her scholarship, her love of life, her style, the passion for her subject that she transmitted to her students, her kindness and her humanity and her progressive values. Before we celebrate Katherine's life in glorious words and music, may I remind you to turn off your phones, not just to put them on silent, but to turn them off. As you will know, there's going to be the sounding of a nationwide alarm at 3 o'clock. Of course, if someone's phone does go off, it's not the end of the world. I'm now delighted to introduce Professor Heather O'Donoghue, Professor of Old Norse and Vigfusen, Rousing Reader in Ancient Icelandic Literature and Antiquities, University of Oxford. Thank you very much.
When I was asked to speak briefly about Katherine as my colleague when we were tutorial fellows together, I thought it would be easy. Perhaps an emotional experience, but an easy thing to do. It actually has proved harder than I anticipated to do justice to what a wonderful colleague Katherine was. When I came to Somerville as a tutorial fellow in 1978, Katherine had already been in post for over 10 years. But the last few years of that decade must have been difficult for her. Her colleague, Rosemary Wolfe, the great medieval scholar, was suffering from what proved to be a terminal illness. And after Rosemary's death, Katherine must have longed for a colleague who would help take the weight of the responsibility for English studies at Somerville. Well, I'm pretty sure I wasn't the kind of colleague she must have been hoping for. For a start, I was terribly inexperienced. And moreover, I was expecting my first baby. It was my very first term at Somerville, and it was spent on maternity leave. But for my own part, I could not have hoped for a better colleague. She was unfailingly supportive, and she too, of course, had family responsibilities. She was loyal, she was kind, she was generous with her time, she was always ready to cover for me, and she was inspiring and she was fun. When my first baby was born, she even turned up at my house amidst all the chaos and the clutter, and she made tea and she reassured me about how much babies might sleep, or not, and how much they might feed or cry, and whether I would ever be able to read a book again. So I suppose I saw a side to Katherine that many who knew her in Oxford did not. Now, one of the oddnesses about the relationships between subject tutors in Oxford colleges is that although they are tightly and indeed daily bound together by their joint responsibility for the students in their subject, as far as their own academic work, and perhaps surprisingly their teaching too, they operate in completely different spheres. But in those days, there was one exception to this. Katherine and I interviewed entrance candidates together, and that was when I saw firsthand how she engaged with students, and that was when I perhaps learnt most from her. Of course, I was bowled over by the amount that she knew, and how she could offer a candidate their own choice of author or text to talk about, especially in those days when ambitious teachers would prime their sixth formers to try and impress us with difficult or arcane reading. But it was her attitude to those tongue-tied and always nervous young women that taught me the most. One anecdote shows her in action. A very anxious candidate was being coaxed by Katherine to talk, and she was asked about her favourite bit of A-level work. The student tentatively expressed a keenness for her Shakespeare text, King Lear. Katherine was delighted, of course, and she asked the young woman if she was surprised by the events of Act 2 and of how Goneril and Regan had shaped up. The sixth former turned a little bit pale and fell silent. Katherine leaned forward and nodded encouragingly. Looking down at the hem of her neat Laura Ashley suit, the student said that they'd been reading King Lear aloud in class and that they hadn't actually got beyond the end of Act 1. My own heart sank in sympathy. But Katherine was intrigued. Didn't you read on yourself? The student said her teacher didn't encourage that. Have you never seen the play performed or heard a retelling of it? Apparently not. I wished myself anywhere but in Katherine's room in Maitland with this unfortunate candidate. But Katherine was enchanted. She had, she said, never had the opportunity to find out how Act 1 appeared to someone who didn't know the story. The girl warmed to Katherine's evident enthusiasm and sincerity, and soon they were deep in conversation. We offered that sixth former a place, and she became, in time, a distinguished scholar in her own right. I learnt a lot from that encounter, about teaching everyone's engagement with literature as worthy of interest and as always offering the possibility of joy or enlightenment, about never talking down to inexperienced readers, about being honest with them, and about empathy and patience and seeing potential in unexpected places. Katherine exemplified all these things in her teaching and in her research and also in her friendships. I will always be grateful for her example. Thank you.
To speak of Katherine as an academic collaborator is to speak of her as a scholar, a biographer, an editor, a literary critic, and above all, as a friend. In all of these fields, she excelled and had that most enviable ability of making the familiar new and the new familiar. By looking afresh at poems and plays, lives and documents, she used her common sense and her deep curiosity about people to find new meanings in them. She made many literary discoveries and thought deeply and imaginatively, in the best sense of the word, about them. But her distinguishing characteristic was perhaps the pleasure and the enthusiasm she conveyed in thinking and writing about her favourite Elizabethan authors, the famous Sidney, Shakespeare, Johnson, and the relatively less well-known, for example, the Countess of Pembroke, Thomas Nash, Richard Tarleton, and Robert Sidney. For her, these men and women were people who spent their lives in identifiable worlds, animated by feelings, interests, concerns, and ideas that are not so different from our own. Their works grew out of their worlds and became images of their lives. Besides friends and colleagues, Katherine's principal collaborators were those great scholars of the past whose work she used daily, at home, in Oxford, or in the upper reading room. Her regular companions there were Edmund Malone, Sidney Lee, Albert Feuerer, R.B. McKerrow, E.K. Chambers, Herford and Simpson, William Ringler and Samuel Schoenbaum, among many others. She regularly disagreed with them, but where she did, this became the starting place for new ideas and subjects to pursue. An acerbic critic of Katherine's said that she didn't know the difference between literary criticism and gossip. This was not meant kindly. But for me, it's what makes her work so distinctive. She had spent a lifetime reading her authors and getting to know them, and she justifiably felt quite at home in their presence. Gossip, along with food and drink, animate life and scholarship at Oxford. Katherine enjoyed all three and saw no division between their relevance to the past and the present. What was meant as a put-down struck me when I first heard it from her as high praise. She brought an intimate knowledge of writers and a generous understanding and imaginative sympathy to her scholarly work. In our long conversation, which extended over more than 30 years, but which was sadly attenuated in the teens of this century, we ranged over a wide variety of Renaissance writers, returning again and again to Sidney and Shakespeare. That variety was witnessed from our earliest piece of joint work during the 1980s on the Elizabethan and the Shakespeare entries for the 5th edition of the Oxford Companion to English Literature, edited by Margaret Drabble. To our last collaboration on the Arden edition of Shakespeare's poems. Less formally, she sent me many of her articles in draft form, her biographies of Sidney and Shakespeare. The first, chapter by chapter, the second, complete. I always enjoyed reading and commenting on these drafts. And on her fine and provocative introduction to the Arden edition of the Sonnets. We moved from typewritten wads of paper sent by post to flurries of emails and Word documents. With the poems, we regularly exchanged work as we produced it. While often being critical and corrective, Katherine's comments were always warm and encouraging. An edition is both a set task to be completed by a certain date and something that can be drawn out for years. Katherine worked fast, her mind often working faster. She thought as she wrote, making associative leaps and jumps. Sometimes a missing link needed to be supplied, sometimes a date corrected and the narrative or argument adjusted. But she was by no means doctrinaire. Her deep knowledge of the period never prevented her from seeing the wood from the trees, or for that matter, the trees from the wood. There was nothing cynical or ideologically driven in her ideas. And as anyone who has read her commentary on the sonnets will know, she found her duty as an editor anything but dull. The last piece of work of hers we corresponded about touched on a manuscript account of Richard Tarleton that she had found in the Public Record Office, appearing before the Queen in 1578. It was to have played a part in her projected book on Shakespeare's Fools. I tried to persuade her that the manuscript might be in the handwriting of Gabriel Harvey, the butt of Thomas Nash's savagely brilliant literary attacks. But that was a bridge too far for Katherine, and quite rightly, she stuck to what could be known for certain about the description. Alas, for one who loved folly and the absurd as much as she did, the book on fools was never to be finished.
Ben Jonson's elegy for Thomas Nash. No well-deserving muse but will impart her flowers to crown his industry and art. When any wronged him living, they did feel his spirit quick as powder, sharp as steel. But to his friends, his faculties were fair, pleasant and mild as the most temperate air. Oh, pardon me, dear friend, if fear control the zealous purpose of my wounded soul. Fear to be censured glorious in thy praise, a maim soon taken in these humorous days when every dudgeon judgment stabs at wit. Yet for thy love, this truth I'll not omit, which most may make thy merits to appear, and joy thy glad surviving friends to hear. Thou diedst a Christian, faithful, penitent, inspired with happy thoughts and confident. This, though thy latest grace, was not the least, which still shall live when all else are deceased. Farewell, Great Spirit. My pen, attired in black, shall, whilst I am, still weep and mourn thy lack.
Disgrace with fortune and men's eyes, I all alone beweep my outcast state, and trouble deaf heaven with my bootless cries, and look upon my Wishing me like to one more rich in hope, featured like him with friends possessed, desiring this man's art and that man's scope, with what I most enjoy contented least. Yet in these thoughts myself almost despising, haply I think on thee and then my state, like to the lark at break of day arising from sullen earth, sings hymns at heaven's gate. For thy sweet love remembered such wealth brings, that then I scorn to change my state with kings. When most I wink, then do mine eyes best see. For all the day they view things unrespected, but when I sleep, in dreams they look on thee, and darkly bright are bright in dark directed. Then thou whose shadows doth make bright, how would thy shadows form happy show to the clear day with thy much clearer light, when to unseen eyes thy shade shines so. How would I say mine eyes be blessed made by looking on thee in the living day, when in dead night thy fair imperfect shade through heavy sleep on sightless eyes doth stay. All days are nights to see till I see thee, and nights bright days when dreams do show thee me. All days are nights to see till I see thee, and nights bright days when dreams do show thee me.
Hello, I'm Helen Hackett. I first met Katherine in 1985 when I was an MPhil student, and I was sent to her for tutorials on the sonnet. And I still feel awestruck when I reflect on the extraordinary privilege of 8 weekly meetings with Katherine Duncan-Jones, one of the world's leading sonnet scholars. Katherine then became the supervisor of my DPhil thesis on literary images of Elizabeth I. She guided this to success while also encouraging my interest in the rediscovery of Renaissance women writers. And beyond my DPhil, Katherine continued to be a wise and generous mentor. She was an indefatigable source of encouragement and practical support, as I'm sure she was also to other students and colleagues. Some of my most significant life decisions were based on her sage advice, and I often sent her draft work to read, on which she gave astute and honest feedback. I also valued Katherine as a role model. Of course, she exemplified the highest standards of scholarship and academic rigour, but she also demonstrated that these professional standards could be maintained while bringing up a family. I'd been an undergraduate at Lady Margaret Hall in the 1980s, when many female fellows were unmarried and childless. We sometimes forget, I think, how recently this was the norm. So it's important to emphasise that Katherine was unusual and inspiring as an academic working mother. Over the decades, it was thrilling to see Katherine's publications mounting up, transforming the field of early modern literature and bringing her worldwide renown. I'm thinking of works like her biography of Sydney, Ungentle Shakespeare, the Arden edition of Shakespeare's sonnets, and many more, including, of course, the edition of Shakespeare's poems that she collaborated on with Henry. These volumes quickly became essential reference points for academics, while Katherine also engaged with wide audiences through public channels like In Our Time and the Times Literary Supplement. But I want to speak particularly about Katherine as a friend. We often got together in Oxford or in London. Conversation was wide-ranging, thought-provoking, and always highly entertaining. I think Katherine especially enjoyed times when I brought my children with me. I have many postcards from her which turn up as pleasant surprises, as bookmarks in my books. One is dated the 27th of August, 2006, when my son Ed was 10 and my daughter Marina was 8, and I brought it with me. The picture is the banner of the Oxford Women's Student Society for Women's Suffrage. And this is the message on the back, in Katherine's unmistakable handwriting. Dear Helen, what a lovely day yesterday, and thank you and the children so much for the charming candles. It was a real joy to see everyone. I've made 2 of Marina's drawings into a sort of collage. You can imagine every time I happen upon one of these postcards, I hear Katherine's voice again, and it transports me back to a happy moment with her. Katherine is also still with me in her books, which surround me in my study and are in constant use. I frequently find myself mentioning her in a lecture or recommending one of her works to a student, and I know that many of us here today share in this ongoing participation in Katherine's legacy. Losing Katherine has been deeply painful, but there's consolation in the ways in which she lives on, in her monumental achievements as a scholar, critic, and teacher, in our gratitude for all the things she did for us, and in the impressions left on us by small bright moments that we shared with her.
Shakespeare's Sonnet 60. Like as the waves make towards the pebbled shore, so do our minutes hasten to their end. Each changing place which that which goes before, in sequent toil all forwards do contend. Nativity, once in the main of light, crawls to maturity, wherewith being crowned, crooked eclipses 'gainst his glory fight, and time that gave doth now his gift confound. Time doth transfix the flourish set on youth, and delves the parallels in beauty's brow, feeds on the rarities of nature's truth, and nothing stands but for his scythe to mow. And yet to times in hope my verse shall stand, praising thy worth despite his cruel hand.
Speaking about Katherine Duncan-Jones on behalf of all those students she taught at Somerville presents some challenges. Quite simply, different generations of students knew a different KDJ. When, for her 70th birthday in 2011, I compiled a book of messages from many of those she taught, I was sent a huge variety of memories. Several of those, of course, were memories of her appearance. Katherine used to tell a story of the college treasurer at the time she began teaching at Somerville, persuading her to put a greater proportion of her salary into her pension and less into her clothing budget. And how, in later life, she was grateful, although at the time she'd rather resented the restriction on her spending. Whenever a student knew her, it appears that people remembered her fashionably attired. One early student commented, "My recollection of KDJ during my time at Somerville was of this mini-skirted, seemingly very swinging chick." Katherine had flair and enjoyed buying clothes, creating an appearance that people clearly remembered vividly. Another former undergraduate, a little later, remembered her in artistic terms, but Katherine would have been amused by the humorous juxtaposition of esoteric and earthly. She was simultaneously of our world and beyond it, a fey pre-Raphaelite beauty, riding a bike precariously through the city with the de rigueur long locks of the 60s and fashionable swaying ropes of beads. As one of her students from the late 1980s, I too remember her appearance on her bicycle, as if in full sail, gown flying, on her way to give a lecture at the English faculty or going to the Bodleian. Thoughts of her cycling around Oxford remind me of another of KDJ's chief characteristics, her love of breaking the rules and of surprising people. As many of you will know, Katherine's presence in Oxford rather than Cambridge, the alma mater of most of her family, was rather a rebellion. Told by her mother not to ride a bike, it's no surprise to any of her friends that she immediately took gleeful delight in doing so, riding it with joy around an increasingly busy Oxford until an issue with her eye finally meant that reluctantly she was forced to stop. Her being forced to invest more of her salary in her pension may well have been largely true, but like many of Katherine's stories, it was designed to entertain in a characteristically self-deprecating way. She was a joyous raconteur and happily told stories of people she'd met, from Princess Margaret to Philip Larkin, that made a chat with Katherine often shimmered over with the gold dust of celebrity. Passion for theatre was at her core, and her students were regular consumers of her hugely enjoyable reviews for the TLS. This key part of Katherine's research and her life led to one of her later college events, interviewing Simon Russell Beale in Somerville in 2015. The image of Katherine, just a little before this, sitting in New College as Simon played Falstaff, part academic mentor and part fangirl, still makes me smile. I think most of her students benefited from her enormously wide knowledge of theatrical practice, and many of us remember fondly being taken to see plays. Knowing Katherine in her later years, I loved taking her to the theatre and then seeing her review, which often gave me a whole new perspective on the play I'd seen with her. In Oxford for over a decade, she created a format for Malone Society study days, where she staged an almost forgotten play and then asked experts to speak about the play we'd all seen. I really enjoyed stage managing some of these, and though not an actor in any sense of the word, I have her to thank for once playing a couple of minor roles in The Tragedy of Hoffmann at Magdalen. One of them, in a line of veiled mutes, was about the limit of my acting ability. At another point in the play, where we appeared, as rebellious servants trying to cause a brawl by shaking with enthusiasm a variety of rather oddly chosen implements from Katherine's kitchen, I remember vividly the rustle going round the audience, composed largely of English students and early modern researchers, when people realised that one of these working-class ruffians was Katherine Duncan-Jones. In her teaching, Katherine was never a woman to suffer fools gladly, and one of her most remembered questions in tutorials was her rather startled, "Oh, do you really think
so, which sent most of us back from our unconsidered position on a text and made us think a little more deeply. But the peculiarities of the Oxford admissions system meant that all her students know that whatever else may have gone well or not over the years, KDJ saw potential in them. As well as the academic rigour we valued so much, she showed enormous personal kindness, whether, as Recollections for her 70th birthday illustrated, that was providing coffee and academic guidance, inviting people for meals to her home, or supplying whiskey for a broken heart. Her support for those of us she taught led to a huge loyalty, long-term friendships, and contact over decades. Her pride in her students' achievements was great, whether that was receiving copies of books they'd written, hearing about their children, or seeing them as become professors in her own faculty. Her Somerville students owe KDJ a huge debt of gratitude and will, I know, join with me in remembering her intellectual encouragement, her important role in fostering the work of women at all levels in higher education, and her personal support and friendship. We all hold our various personal memories of a woman who was a shining light in the history of both the Oxford English faculty and Somerville.
Astrophil and Stella, Sonnet 1 by Sir Philip Sidney. Loving in truth, and fain in verse my love to show, that she, dear she, might take some pleasure of my pain. Pleasure might cause her read, reading might make her know. Knowledge might pity win, and pity grace obtain. I sought fit words to paint the blackest face of woe, studying inventions fine, her wits to entertain, oft turning others' leaves, to see if thence would flow some fresh and fruitful showers upon my sunburned brain. But words came halting forth, wanting invention's stay. Invention, nature's child, fled stepdame studies blows, and others' feet still seemed but strangers in my way. Thus great with child to speak, and helpless in my throes, biting my truant pen, beating myself for spite. Fool, said my muse to me, look in thy heart and write.
As a careful housewife runs to catch one of her feathered creatures broke away, sets down her babe and makes all swift dispatch in pursuit of the thing she would have stayed. Whilst her neglected child holds her in chase, cries to catch her whose busy care is bent, to follow that which flies before her face, not prizing her poor infant's discontent. So run'st thou after that which flies from thee, whilst I, thy babe, chase thee afar behind. But if thou catch thy hope, turn back to me, and play the mother's part kiss me, be kind. So will I pray that thou mayst have thy will. If thou turn back and my loud crying still, if thou turn back, if thou turn back, if thou turn back, and my loud crying still.
Thank you so much for being here today. It would have meant so much to my mother to have so many friends, family members, colleagues and former students gather together to celebrate her life and have a party. I'd like to use the time to express my profound gratitude for having had Katherine Duncan-Jones as my mother. I felt very close to her all my life. I often felt frustrated or irritated by her in the ways you can only feel with the people you're most close to. I feel more and more aware of how much we had in common and how much she taught me and gave me. I still feel close to her. She's ever present in my dreams and my memories, and I'm grateful for everything she gave me. I'm going to enumerate just 5 of the values and qualities for which I feel most grateful. The first is her love and her kindness, which I think she showed to everyone here. She had a great capacity for making people feel loved and appreciated. She showed it to her students, to strangers, friends, and family. In childhood, I never questioned her love for me. And when I visited her as an adult, I always knew that she would open the door with great joy and excitement and welcome me in and offer salad, fruit, wine, and eager conversation and gossip. She was an ever-devoted, attentive mother to my sister Bea and me, an equally devoted grandmother to our 6 children, her grandchildren. Her great capacity for love sometimes included spitting rage at anyone who might be perceived or imagined to have slighted any one of us. She was also capable of selfless and devoted kindness, of which I'll give a very trivial example. She loved playing Scrabble until almost the very end of her life. It was only after many years of playing with her that I fully began to appreciate the fact that despite having a keenly competitive streak and loving the game, she genuinely wanted me to win more than her, and she was happier when I scored a large amount than when she did. Another very charming element of her Scrabble play was that she tended to choose words based more on their poetic value than their points. Her most oft-repeated phrase when putting down a word was, "Not very valuable, I'm afraid, but it is rather a nice word." Whenever I won a game against her through the low trick of playing boring little words in high-scoring locations, I knew it was because I wasn't as good a person as she was. The next of my 5 traits is a sort of cluster of her patience, her loyalty, and her determination. She was a very strong person. Her star sign, you would think that she was such a rational person that she wouldn't have minded about star signs, but she talked about the fact that her star sign was Taurus, and she identified with the stubbornness of the bull. She was strong and she could stick with things. One of my most vivid childhood memories is when on holiday in Scotland we descended a hill and found ourselves suddenly face to face with a literal bull. My mother, who sometimes seemed timid in unfamiliar situations, showed enormous courage in protecting the children by clapping in the bull's face and startling it enough that with her tenacity that the bull turned away. She had outbulled the bull. And I think of her as somebody who was able to outbull bulls, to take on these enormous challenges and startle people so much that they would turn away. She was a protector to all of us, to both me and my sister all our lives, and I think to many of us, to her students and friends as well. It must have been very difficult for her to raise my sister Bea and me. She cooked every family meal while continuing her full-time job and her very productive scholarly pursuits. But I never remember her complaining about the domestic labor she performed for us. There was always joy and creativity in the ways that she managed family life, making wholesome and usually very economical and comforting meals for us, like toad in the hole and eggy bread. She had many excellent practical skills, which I think might startle people who knew her only as Professor Katherine Duncan-Jones. I'm grateful that she taught me how to knit, how to sew, how to darn holes in socks, how to make a cake, as well as other crucial life skills, like how to do your homework on time, which she herself was very good at. Her patience and her deep kindness enabled her to keep going with tasks that many far less clever Oxford professors would have found boring or beneath them, like pushing children and grandchildren on swings, or singing endless nursery rhymes and lullabies. Despite her cleverness and her vast learning, she was not at all grand or self-important. She had a dogged stick-with-itness and deep loyalties, whether to people or to more abstract entities, places or institutions, like the works of Shakespeare, Stratford-on-Avon, Somerville College, and above all, the Upper Reading Room and Duke Humphrey in the Bodleian Library, where she spent almost every weekday morning for most of her life. Once she had a routine that worked for her, whether it was morning coffee in the King's Arms or the weekly Al Shami takeout with Jeremy Cato, she stuck with it. Her determined persistence enabled her to hang on to her own brilliant and original ideas against resistance or challenges, and to persist with her numerous large-scale scholarly endeavours. Whenever I feel stuck on a piece of writing, I think of her wonderful airy hand gesture, mimicking the pen flying across the page, and how she quoted from James Thurber of The New Yorker, "Don't get it right, get it written." She always got it written, while also getting family supper on the table by 7 o'clock. Number 3 on my list is her quickness and her sense of humour. She was a funny, witty person who loved to laugh. Many of her favourite plays, including from Shakespeare but also all over, and almost all her favourite TV shows, from Fawlty Towers to SpongeBob, were comedies. She was, until the very last phase of her life, always incredibly quick-witted in conversation. Her humour was whimsical, often self-deprecating and zany, not cruel. She laughed with people, not at them, even when she was gossiping about people. Her wit often involved wordplay, not snark. She was, as we've already heard, deeply interested in Elizabethan fools and clowns, and made important discoveries about both William Kemp and Richard Talton. She loved clothes, perhaps as an extension of her interest in theatre and drama. I think many people who are interested in the theatre are also very shy people, and I think that's true of her, that she was both shy and also had a very exuberant and playful side. She loved playing and devising games and pretending. She loved playing with children because she enjoyed the kinds of pretend games and dress-up that kids enjoy. She had a wonderfully distinctive, deep laugh and a smile that lit up her whole face. My daughter Psyche once won an award in school for brightest smile, and I like to think some of that smile came from her grandmother. I like the feeling that she lives on in each of her grandchildren, in her grandson Tom's love of theatre, in Tasha's love of art, in Leo's sense of humour, in Freya's contrariness and wordplay, in Imogen's courage and curiosity about people. So number 4 is courage and curiosity. She had a spirit of adventure. She loved travelling, although she was always glad to get home after a trip and would look forward to being at home just as much as going on a holiday. From a young age, she was very good at getting lost, but she was brave enough to enjoy the experience. I remember a lovely trip to Venice with her, how joyful she was at wandering around the city without a map, completely lost, how warmly she spoke of how Venice is one of the most enjoyable places in the world to get lost in, even though she was also capable of getting lost in Oxford, where she lived for many decades. And she enjoyed that too. She was nervous about coming to the US for the first time and always found it a very alien place, but she bravely visited many times and always expressed her pleasure and curiosity about the strange customs and folkways of the Americans. After her divorce, she went on many different package holidays and cruises, and some of my fondest memories of travelling the world with her, in Italy, Greece, the Netherlands, Prague, and Egypt. She was a wonderful travelling companion because she was so interested in everything, so eager to meet new people, to learn about local cultures and history, ready to enjoy herself. She was never one to whine if a flight was delayed. She always looked on the bright side and relished new sights and the treat of meals out and a glass of wine in the sunshine. Like many people here, I have many happy memories of going to the theatre with her. She was a wonderfully appreciative and insightful theatre-goer, always attuned to anything interesting about the production choices and even the lousiest productions. Despite physical and psychological challenges, like her tendency towards anxiety, her wobbly ankle, her stammer, she overcame all of those and led a very active life until the very last phase. She loved gardening. She loved riding her big, heavy bicycle around Oxford. She loved swimming in a dignified, slow pace, either in the pool or in the sea. She loved walking by the river on the green sward of Port Meadow. My final category, kind of a pair of categories, is beauty and truth, both of which she valued very much. She was an extraordinary scholar, both because of her quick intelligence and her insight as a reader, but also because she was so observant, so attentive to nuance, multiple meanings, and metaphors. Those qualities are everywhere in her edition of Shakespeare's sonnets, but they were everywhere also in her conversation and how she lived her life. She loved beautiful flowers, green trees, landscapes, art, beautiful works of drama, literature, and beautiful words. Her work as a scholar is in some ways iconoclastic. She wasn't afraid to take on the received wisdom and show the ways that it was wrong. As someone who had grown up in Birmingham, to parents who saw life lived anywhere outside Oxford or Cambridge as the outer darkness, the sticks, she was highly attuned to snobbery and status and the ways that even brilliant people, maybe including Shakespeare or Sidney, might be affected by the desire to social climb or by avarice. She was able to see evidence of those traits that maybe more bardolatrous scholars might have overlooked. But her primary impulse was not to knock people down, but to look for beauty, both in nature, in art, and above all in literature and theatre, and also in people, both alive and dead, to notice, to appreciate, to understand. I'm thrilled that so many people here noticed, understood, and appreciated my mother, a brilliant but humble, utterly distinctive, original person. I've never met anyone like her, and I will always be grateful for her.
Thank you, Emily, and thank you to all those who have read and performed this afternoon in this really joyful celebration of the life of an extraordinary woman who led a remarkable life. The tributes today have encapsulated this woman who was a mother, a colleague, a tutor, a great scholar, and a friend. She was shy, she was exuberant, she was strong, she was brave, she outbulled bulls. Well, who knew it? Gosh. She valued truth and beauty. She was loyal. She inspired people. She was kind. She was fun. She displayed an extraordinary attitude to anxious and tongue-tied applicants, and that was a great story we heard. And that she encouraged people to have joy in their learning, and she brought them to an enlightenment. She must have transformed many lives. And I think that one of the many great things that she did was when she retired, she established a theatre fund to enable English students to attend performances of Shakespeare, and that lives on, which is great. She found empathy and potential in the most unexpected places. She had deep curiosity as a scholar and found pleasure and enthusiasm about her favourite Elizabethan authors. She found new ideas and paths to pursue. She provided sage advice to her colleagues, many of whom were younger, and clearly that is valued to this day. She was a loving mother, and I so admire the way in which she must have juggled all that she did as an academic, as a tutor, but also maintaining that family life. And my goodness, was she practical? Who would have thought it? That's just wonderful. She was a joyous raconteur. She loved to tell stories. She was witty and she loved to laugh. So I think it's absolutely wonderful that we've had this opportunity this afternoon to pay tribute to this woman who truly was remarkable. I wish that I had really known Katherine for so many reasons, including I would have loved to play Scrabble with her because she would certainly have won. I pay tribute to the organisers of this joyous event, and I have to say that I think it was splendid planning that there was a performance of 2 sonnets, and in the middle of it, 3 o'clock. Brilliant planning. So thank you, Katherine, Professor Katherine Duncan-Jones, for being a wonderful human being. You were humble, but you left us with the greatest legacy, and it's been a pleasure, an honour, a privilege for everybody here to have known her. Before we finally hear from our singer, I should remind you that we're all invited to tea in the Flora Anderson Hall after this celebration, when we can continue to relive our experiences with Katherine and to exchange views and stories. I think it's going to be enormous fun. It's going to be a party, I think. But I would also encourage you to look at a very beautiful bench which the family have donated, which is in the quad, and it has a plaque in Catherine's name. So please do that. And with that, I will invite our singers to give their final performance, which I know will be a joy.
Like the beat, beat, beat of the tom-tom when the jungle shadows fall. Like the tick-tick-tock of the stately clock as it stands against the wall. Like the drip-drip-drop of the raindrops when the summer showers through. So a voice within me keeps repeating you, night and day. You are the one, only you beneath the moon and under the sun. Whether near me or far, it's no matter, darling, where you are, I think of you night and day and night. Why is it so that this longing for you follows wherever I go? In the roaring traffic's boom, in the silence of my lonely room, I think of you night and day and night, under the hide of me. There's such a hungry yearning burning inside of me, and its torment won't be through till you let me spend my life making